90 minutes, Mr. Reed. Prove you belong here. The microphone carried Catherine Sterling's voice through the packed auditorium, clear and cold as glass. 800 people held their breath. Cameras hovered above the stage, live streaming every second to the university's website. A red digital timer glowed on the wall. 0 hours 10 minutes. 10 minutes left. Malcolm Reed stood in front of the massive whiteboard, chalk dust on his dark sleeves, the faint scent of bleach clinging to him. His janitor's uniform, with the Whitmore University crest stitched in fading blue, looked painfully out of place under the auditorium lights. He didn't move. Not yet. The crowd whispered like a restless tide. Students in neatly pressed blazers leaned forward, professors adjusted their glasses, and someone near the back coughed softly. Sterling watched from behind her podium, her posture perfect, her eyes sharp and expectant. "Advanced theory cannot be faked," she said into the microphone, a comment disguised as instruction. A few in the audience chuckled. Malcolm's hand tightened around the chalk. He turned back to the board, his reflection faintly visible in the glossy surface. The equation in front of him sprawled like a battlefield, a labyrinth of symbols, integrals, and Greek letters that had defeated every student who'd tried it. The Sterling Standard, the university called it. A test of brilliance, created by the youngest full professor in Whitmore's history. He had 10 minutes to finish what no one else could. He began to write. The chalk squeaked, high and sharp, breaking the silence. One line, two. He paused, frowned, and wiped it away with the side of his hand. A soft murmur rippled through the room. He tried again. This time faster, heart pounding so loud he could almost hear it echo against the walls. Wrong. The logic collapsed halfway through. He exhaled, erased again. The timer blinked. 0 hours 8 minutes and 12 seconds. Sterling's voice floated from behind him. Calm, cool, measured. "If you wish to withdraw, Mr. Reed, we can still end this gracefully." He didn't turn around. The chalk trembled in his hand. Grace had nothing to do with it. Grace was for people allowed to fail quietly. "Come on, Malcolm," someone whispered from the audience. A student he recognized from the cafeteria line. Another voice answered. "He shouldn't even be up there." The words cut deeper than they should have. He stared at the blank section of the board and, for a brief second, his reflection blurred. He could almost see the outline of his mop leaning against the back door, the yellow "Caution Wet Floor" sign still drying near the entrance. He shouldn't be here. But then he remembered the seminar 3 days ago, the way Sterling's face had twisted into a polite smile when she caught him near the board, erasing an old equation. "Custodians don't rewrite proofs," she'd said. And the class had laughed. He hadn't planned to answer her, but something inside him snapped that day. He'd pointed out the misplaced variable in her equation, his voice steady despite the heat crawling up his neck. And when she checked, she realized he was right. Her silence had been worse than the laughter. Now, she stood less than 20 feet away, arms crossed, watching him struggle in front of her own creation. The timer hit 0 hours 7 minutes. His throat felt dry. He tried to recall the problem structure: functional minimization under dynamic constraint. He'd seen something like this before. Years ago, in a seminar room at MIT, before life pulled him in another direction. Back then, chalk dust had meant discovery, not shame. He closed his eyes for half a breath. "Don't think about the cameras. Think about the numbers." His hand moved almost on instinct, drawing curves, substituting terms, rearranging functions. The old rhythm returned, faint but real. He could feel the audience's impatience pressing against his back. Sterling's stilettos clicked softly as she shifted her weight. He stopped halfway through a derivation. It didn't fit. The pattern was wrong. The approach, the modern one, wouldn't lead to a closed form. He needed something simpler, older. Something that didn't rely on computer-assisted approximations. A memory surfaced. An old professor at MIT once saying, "Sometimes the shortest path is the one forgotten." The chalk moved again, this time slower, deliberate. He redrew the base equation and began manipulating it using variational principles, Euler-Lagrange, direct energy minimization. The method had been abandoned decades ago for being too tedious. But he wasn't after speed. He was after truth. The board filled again. Sterling frowned, sensing a shift she didn't understand. 5 minutes, she said, her voice tighter now. The timer blinked 0 hours 5 minutes. A low murmur spread through the audience as they noticed the pattern forming on the board. The seemingly chaotic scribbles began to align into symmetry. For the first time, Malcolm didn't feel their stares as judgment. They were watching something unfamiliar, respect born of confusion. He finished a derivative, circled a term, and drew a quiet arrow toward the final expression. It balanced perfectly. He stepped back. His chest rose and fell. Silence. Sterling approached, her heels echoing against the stage. She stared at the board, her eyes scanning each line, each transition. The expression was elegant, concise, and undeniably correct. "That's not possible," she whispered, but her voice betrayed her disbelief. "You used an old method," he said softly. "Sometimes the old ways still work." He set the chalk down. His hand trembled not from fear, but from the weight of everything this moment meant. He wasn't supposed to win. He wasn't supposed to belong. Yet the truth on the board cared little for titles or uniforms. It simply existed. The audience erupted not in wild cheers, but in stunned applause, hesitant at first, then growing. Sterling stood motionless. The timer hit 0. The camera lights blinked red, capturing every second of her silence. Malcolm stepped away from the board, his palms still white with chalk. In that instant, the line between professor and janitor blurred. All that remained was the equation and the man who refused to walk away from it. Outside, through the glass doors, the city lights of Boston flickered against the dark winter sky. He would go home tonight, change out of this uniform, and return to the quiet apartment where an oxygen machine hummed beside his mother's bed. But for now, standing under the harsh auditorium lights, Malcolm Reed had already reclaimed something he'd lost long ago: his name, his worth, his place among those who believed knowledge belonged only to the privileged. The audience quieted as Sterling finally spoke. Her voice was softer, stripped of arrogance. "Mr. Reed," she said, "how did you learn this?" He met her gaze. "The floors remember," he replied. "You hear things when you clean up after genius long enough." A few people laughed, nervous, uncertain, but the truth behind his words lingered. Sterling lowered her eyes, perhaps realizing that the man she'd tried to humiliate had just reminded her why knowledge was sacred. The timer on the wall reset to blank. The competition was over, but something larger had begun. And for the first time in years, Malcolm allowed himself to breathe. 3 days earlier, the hallways of Whitmore were quieter, washed in the hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of sneakers on marble. The morning smelled faintly of polish and burnt coffee. Malcolm Reed pushed his cart past a row of lecture halls, his headphones dangling from one ear, the other tuned to the rhythm of squeaky wheels. The university was waking up, graduate students whispering formulas, professors clutching paper cups, someone playing a piano in the music wing. He had walked these corridors for almost 8 years, long enough to know where the tiles cracked, where the heating vent hummed too loud. His shift was nearly over when he stepped into Sterling's classroom. The board was filled with half-erased symbols, functional equations, integrals, and a single phrase written in fine chalk. "Assume continuity." Malcolm stopped. Old instincts stirred. The symbols were familiar, like music he hadn't heard since youth. He reached for the eraser, then hesitated. A variable in the third line bothered him. He stared at it a moment longer, chalk in hand. He corrected the term, barely aware of what he was doing. It wasn't pride, it was reflex, the kind you never lose. The door opened. Professor Sterling entered, heels striking the floor like a metronome. Her blonde hair framed a face trained never to look uncertain. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Just cleaning, ma'am." Her eyes darted to the board, then back to him. "Did you write that?" He hesitated. "I adjusted a small error." A short, brittle laugh escaped her lips. "Adjusted? Mr." She glanced at his name tag. "Mr. Reed. I assure you, my equations don't require janitorial corrections." A few students had followed her in. Their laughter joined hers. Soft but sharp. Malcolm lowered the chalk. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, and left the room. That evening, he worked overtime in the library. The scent of old books and disinfectant mingled as he mopped the long aisles. A television in the corner played muted news about the upcoming Oilers Challenge, a prestigious competition where Whitmore's brightest would compete for the Sterling Fellowship. He paused, leaning on the mop handle, staring at the banner that hung from the ceiling. Genius recognized, talent rewarded. A bitter smile crossed his face. In the reflection of the polished floor, his own image blurred with the bold letters of genius. Maybe the world didn't see both could coexist. He finished his rounds and slipped into a study cubicle. The problem on the banner replayed in his mind the same structure he'd glimpsed in Sterling's class. He pulled a piece of discarded chalk from his pocket and began scribbling on a scrap of cardboard. The equations came to him like breathing, though he hadn't touched serious math in years. His hands moved slower now, but the logic was still sharp, the beauty still there. The night guard, old Mr. Donnelly, walked by with his German shepherd. The dog sniffed, then barked once. "Easy, Duke," the guard said, then looked at Malcolm. "Late shift again?" "Almost done," Malcolm answered. Donnelly nodded, squinting at the cardboard. "Whatever you're doing, looks smarter than my crossword." They both chuckled. When the lights flickered for closing time, Malcolm folded the cardboard carefully and tucked it beside his MIT ID in his locker. The next morning, rain fell over Boston, turning the sidewalks into silver ribbons. In his small apartment, Malcolm brewed instant coffee, the kind that tasted like metal but cost less than $2 a jar. The oxygen machine hummed steadily in the corner. His mother, fragile but awake, sat propped up with a blanket around her shoulders. "You look tired, baby," she said, her voice thin. "Long night." He smiled faintly. "You remember that math contest I told you about? They're holding it again." She reached for his hand. "Don't let them make you small." He nodded, not trusting his voice. When she drifted back to sleep, he sat at the table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills, then at the folded cardboard beside the MIT ID. A memory flickered the day he'd left MIT, barely 30 credits from a PhD. His advisor had told him, "Family comes first, Malcolm. The world will wait." But it hadn't waited. It had moved on without him. Later that day, back at Whitmore, he found himself outside the administration office, staring at a notice pinned on the board. "Contestants may apply by Thursday." His fingers brushed the paper. Behind him, a familiar voice said, "Considering signing up, Mr. Reed?" It was Sterling. Her smile was polite, but the air around her crackled with condescension. "They do say courage is admirable, even misplaced." He turned to face her. "Ma'am, sometimes courage isn't misplaced. It's just unseen." For a moment, her mask slipped. Then she smirked. "Then I'll look forward to seeing yours on display." When she walked away, the scent of her perfume lingered, sharp as ozone before a storm. He didn't know if it was defiance or desperation, but he filled out the form that afternoon. The clerk looked at his uniform, then at the form, hesitated, and stapled it with an uncertain shrug. That evening, he sat on a bench outside the science building, rain dripping from the awning. The lights from the cafeteria shimmered in the puddles. Students passed by laughing, debating, carrying laptops and ambition. He watched them with quiet detachment, feeling both older and invisible. Then a woman's voice broke through his thoughts. "You really signed up? Doctor?" Elena Rodriguez stood beside him, umbrella in hand. She was visiting from Stanford for the judging panel. Her tone wasn't mocking, just surprised. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Do you know what you're getting into? Sterling's competition isn't fair." "Neither is the world," he answered. She studied him for a moment. "You remind me of someone I used to teach." "Maybe he cleaned floors, too," he said with a small smile. "Maybe he did," she replied. "And maybe he was smarter than everyone in the room." Her eyes softened. "Good luck, Mr. Reed." After she left, Malcolm stayed on the bench, listening to the rain until the sky cleared. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, and for a heartbeat, it almost felt like the world was giving him permission to try again. 2 days later, the contest began. Sterling's face was on every poster, every digital screen. The campus buzzed with anticipation. Malcolm walked into the building that morning with his uniform freshly pressed, his mop stored in the supply closet. He passed students whispering, "Is that the janitor?" He didn't look at them. He carried only a single piece of chalk in his pocket, smoothed from years of use. In the auditorium, he took his seat at the back, waiting for his turn, heart steady. Rodriguez caught his eye across the room and gave a brief nod. Sterling noticed, her expression unreadable. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced. "Welcome to the first round of the Sterling Standard. Let us separate brilliance from bravado." The words echoed through the hall. Polished and cruel. Malcolm looked down at his calloused hands. For the first time in years, they didn't feel like tools for cleaning, they felt like instruments waiting to speak. The screen flickered with the first problem, dense and elegant. He smiled faintly. "Let's see if the floors remember," he whispered, and began to write. By the end of the second day, Whitmore's campus buzzed like a beehive. Every corridor seemed to echo with talk about the janitor who wouldn't quit. Some said he was a fluke, a curiosity the internet would forget next week. Others whispered that Sterling had met her match. The Boston Chronicle even sent a small camera crew to cover the final round, sensing drama. Malcolm tried not to notice. He still arrived early, sweeping the hallways before the contestants filed in. The same mop bucket creaking beside him. To him, work was work. Even when the world started watching. That morning, the air outside smelled of cold rain and printer ink. Posters of Sterling's sharp face hung everywhere, the caption reading, "The Sterling Standard, Genius Without Compromise." Rodriguez walked beside Malcolm as he carried a box of supplies down the corridor. "You're trending online," she said softly. "Number janitor math." He chuckled dryly. "Could be worse." "It could also be better," she replied. Sterling's pride won't let her lose quietly. "Be careful." He nodded. The line between encouragement and warning was thin, and he heard both. The auditorium that day was brighter than usual. News cameras framed the stage. Microphones caught the smallest sigh. Sterling stood at the podium, immaculate in her tailored suit, every word rehearsed. "Welcome, everyone, to the final stage of the Sterling Standard. Today's problem is one of elegance and endurance, a reflection of true intellect." Her gaze flicked briefly to Malcolm. "And humility." The students laughed politely. On the big screen, the problem appeared dense, impossible, alive. Even Rodriguez frowned. It was no ordinary challenge. Sterling had taken a theorem from her doctoral thesis, something unpublished, known only within her closed circle. Malcolm felt the weight of her trap before his eyes even reached the end of the question. It wasn't designed to be solved. It was designed to break him. He inhaled slowly. The chalk in his pocket felt warm from his touch, a small anchor against the tide of condescension around him. He glanced at the other contestants. Derek, tall and eager, already scribbling notes. Sarah, Sterling's brightest protégé, eyes darting nervously. He saw no malice in them, just ambition. The true battle wasn't with them. It was with the system that decided who was worthy of being heard. As the timer started, the room fell into a thick, mechanical silence. The ticking clock above the stage sounded louder than any voice. Malcolm bent over his notepad. The symbols danced. His brain worked through the familiar motions: substitution, reduction, differential analysis, but the structure refused to yield. Every modern method ended in contradiction. He looked up briefly. Sterling watched him with a faint smile, the kind reserved for those who had already lost. Behind her, the banners rippled in the vented air, their motto, "Excellence Earned," shimmering like a lie. Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of his mother's quiet breathing machine, of the smell of lemon polish on the floors he cleaned, of every polite nod that meant "stay in your place." Then he remembered the words Mr. Hayes had told him the night before. They'd been sitting in the maintenance room, sharing a thermos of coffee. "You can tell a lot about a person by how they treat dirt," Hayes said. "Some just cover it up. Others clean it properly." "What's that supposed to mean?" Malcolm had asked. Hayes smiled. "You're about to find out." Back in the present, he felt that truth settle inside him. Maybe this wasn't about outsmarting Sterling's equations. Maybe it was about cleaning the false shine off her idea of genius. He started again, this time from the first principle: minimization of energy across a closed boundary. A classic approach, older than most of the people in the room. The method was raw, manual, unassisted. It required patience, intuition, a kind of faith. Sterling noticed. She leaned forward, whispering something to the student beside her. The cameras caught the movement, and Twitter lit up instantly with captions like, "Janitor goes rogue." But Malcolm didn't care. Each line of chalk he drew on the small board beside his desk carried the rhythm of memory. His father, who'd fixed engines by sound alone. His mother, who'd balanced their bills to the cent with shaking hands. Life had been one long proof of endurance. And this, he realized, was just another formula to balance. By the time the first hour passed, sweat had gathered at his temples. His hand cramped from writing. Around him, the other contestants had given up or stared blankly at their notes. Only Sarah kept working, biting her lip. She looked over once. Just a glance. And he saw something in her eyes. Not pity. Not rivalry. But curiosity. Maybe respect. The clock ticked down to 30 minutes. Sterling stood, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Contestants, remember. The goal is not effort, it's precision. If you haven't found it by now, you never will." Rodriguez's eyes narrowed. "That's enough, Catherine. I'm reminding them of the rules," Sterling said, smiling for the cameras. "Let them finish," Rodriguez replied, calm but firm. A quiet tension filled the air. Sterling hesitated, then gestured gracefully toward the clock. "By all means." Malcolm continued, unaware of the standoff behind him. He adjusted one final integral, traced a substitution that simplified the chaos, and stopped. Something clicked. The answer wasn't numerical, it was structural. The problem wasn't meant to be solved in the way it was asked. Sterling had disguised her question as complexity when it was, at heart, a simple geometric identity. He stared at it, disbelief giving way to clarity. It was beautiful. The kind of beauty that didn't need applause. He leaned back, exhaling. His pulse slowed. For the first time in years, he felt at peace with the numbers. When the timer buzzed, marking the end of the round, he set down his chalk. Sterling rose, walking toward the stage. "Time's up," she said. Her tone was final. The room hushed. "Please submit your work." Malcolm handed in his paper. Her eyes flicked over the lines. She frowned, then frowned again. The symbols didn't follow her logic, but they made sense, too much sense. She looked up sharply. "Where did you learn this?" "Cleaning up after other people's mistakes," he said. A ripple of laughter passed through the audience, though it didn't feel cruel this time. Rodriguez leaned forward, examining the page. Her brow furrowed as recognition dawned. The technique, the handwriting, something about it was hauntingly familiar. "This method," she murmured. "It's pre-digital. Analytic geometry." "Old habits," Malcolm said. Sterling straightened, regaining composure. "We'll see if it holds." She handed the papers to the judging panel, her expression calm but her knuckles white. The crowd began to stir, students whispering, reporters typing. Malcolm stood quietly, feeling both lighter and exhausted. Rodriguez caught his eye again, her gaze thoughtful. "You did something rare," she said softly. "You made mathematics human again." He smiled faintly. "I just cleaned the board." When the results were announced that evening, no one seemed surprised. Malcolm Reed had advanced to the final round. Sterling's name trended on social media for all the wrong reasons. Still, she stood at the podium with poise, announcing the outcome as though she had planned it all along. "Tomorrow," she declared, "we will witness whether lightning can strike twice." The crowd applauded. Malcolm walked out of the hall, past the cameras, past the whispers. Outside, the autumn air bit at his skin, sharp and real. The campus clock chimed 7 times, echoing across the quad. He paused, looking back at the glowing windows of Whitmore University. Behind those walls, equations and egos battled daily. But for the first time, he felt neither small nor out of place. Tomorrow would bring another test. But tonight, beneath the fading sky, he allowed himself a small smile. Somewhere between the noise of ambition and the quiet of dignity, he'd found his rhythm again. The final day began under a hard blue sky that made every window on campus glare like ice. Whitmore University buzzed with a nervous excitement that Malcolm could feel the moment he stepped through the main gate. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones gleaming. The kind of attention reserved for scandals or miracles. Students whispered as he passed, some in awe, others smirking, but he walked steadily, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed ahead. Inside the auditorium, technicians adjusted lights and cameras, preparing for the broadcast. The Boston Chronicle had brought a full crew this time. The banner above the stage read, "The Sterling Standard, Final Round Live." Catherine Sterling stood at the podium in a gray suit sharp enough to cut glass, her expression calm, but her fingers tapping a rhythm only nerves could keep. Rodriguez joined her near the judges' table, her gaze steady, curious, cautious. The air smelled of coffee, wires, and tension. Malcolm took his seat, alone at the front, the mop bucket he'd used that morning still drying in the hall outside. He could hear the faint drip of water through the door. It grounded him more than the polite applause that greeted him when Sterling introduced the contestants. "Today," she announced, "we confront not only mathematics but the limits of perseverance. The question presented is taken from my doctoral work, a problem that has resisted formal proof for years. Perhaps, Mr. Reed, you will find it illuminating." Her smile was thin, surgical. The problem appeared on the screen behind her, a dense forest of variables and integrals, elegant in its cruelty. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. She recognized it immediately, a question no one outside of Sterling's old committee could possibly have prepared for. Malcolm read it once, twice, feeling the trap close around him. It wasn't just difficult, it was structured to collapse under its own weight, a test of pride disguised as science. He picked up the chalk anyway. Cameras zoomed in on his hands. He started with the basics, differential transformations, constraint optimization, but every root hit a wall. The methods Sterling expected him to use wouldn't work. She had built a cage out of theory. He looked up. Sterling was watching him, calm, confident, certain of his failure. Behind her, the digital timer began counting down from 90 minutes. He felt the first bead of sweat slip down his neck. The hum of the crowd filled the room, whispers blending into one low vibration of doubt. He erased the board, began again, tried a substitution. No. Tried a Fourier transform. No. The symbols tangled like wire. The timer glowed 0 hours 30 minutes. His arm ached. The camera's red light blinked at him like a silent metronome. Sterling tilted her head. "Withdraw with dignity," she said quietly. But her microphone caught every syllable. The audience gasped. Malcolm lowered the chalk. For a heartbeat, he considered it walking away, letting the world confirm what it already believed. Then he remembered the sound of his mother's voice that morning when he left their apartment. "Don't let them make you small." He set the chalk back against the board. "No, ma'am," he said, softly but firm. "Not yet." He stared at the mess of equations and saw it differently this time. He saw patterns hidden beneath Sterling's modern machinery, something older, simpler. The proof wasn't a puzzle to be forced open. It was a structure waiting to be recognized. He wiped the board clean, his sleeves streaked with white dust. The silence deepened until even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Rodriguez leaned forward. "He's starting over," she whispered. "Why?" "Because he's lost," Sterling replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Malcolm began writing again, slowly this time, drawing curves instead of lines, forming a geometric interpretation, energy minimization, variational logic. The method was ancient, taught decades before Sterling was born. He could hear his old MIT professor's voice echoing in memory. The truth doesn't hide in complexity. It hides in plain sight. The audience leaned in. The timer showed 0 hours 15 minutes. The chalk tapped rhythmically. His focus narrowed until everything else fell away, the whispers, the cameras, even Sterling's presence. It was just him and the problem, as pure as it had ever been. Then something clicked. A relationship between two functions that canceled out the chaos, a symmetry no one else had noticed. His hand flew across the board. The equations aligned like constellations finding their shape. Rodriguez rose from her chair, eyes widening. "He's doing it," she murmured. Sterling blinked, realizing too late what was happening. Malcolm wrote the final expression, circled it, and set the chalk down with trembling fingers. The room held its breath. The timer flashed 0 hours 2 minutes and 3 seconds. He stepped back, heart pounding. "Done," he said quietly. Sterling approached, heels clicking. She stared at the board, scanning the lines, her face shifting from disbelief to irritation to something closer to fear. "That's not possible," she whispered. "You derived it with what is this, classical calculus?" "It's all calculus," he said, his voice steady. "The laws don't change just because the tools do." She said nothing. Rodriguez moved beside her, examining each transition. "It's consistent," she said finally, then louder for the room to hear. "Completely consistent." A murmur swelled through the audience, rolling like thunder. Reporters leaned forward, fingers flying across keyboards. Sterling tried to recover her composure. "We'll have the judges verify," she said quickly. But her tone cracked on the last word. Rodriguez turned toward her. "You just witnessed it verified." The applause began softly, one student, then another, until the entire hall roared. Malcolm stood still, unsure what to do with the sound. Sterling took a step back, color draining from her face. He looked at her, not with triumph but with quiet exhaustion. "You asked me to prove I belonged," he said. "I did." Cameras captured the moment. The board behind him covered in chalk. His uniform streaked white, his eyes calm. For an instant, the narrative everyone had built, the janitor, the underdog, the humiliation, collapsed into silence. There was only the equation, perfect and undeniable. Sterling left the stage before the applause ended. Rodriguez placed a hand on Malcolm's arm. "You understand what you just did?" "Solved a problem," he said. She shook her head. "You changed one." Later, after the crowd thinned and the cameras turned off, Malcolm stood alone in the auditorium. The board still glowed faintly under the lights. The smell of chalk dust hung in the air. He could hear the echo of the applause like a ghost. He thought about calling his mother, about telling her it was over. But words felt too small for what had just happened. Instead, he picked up the chalk stub from the tray, broke it cleanly in half, and slipped one piece into his pocket. The other he left on the podium beside the eraser. Outside, the wind off the Charles River carried the scent of cold water and diesel. He stepped into it slowly, the night air stinging his skin. Reporters waited at the gates, shouting his name, but he kept walking. He wasn't interested in interviews or headlines. The equation was done. The rest would take care of itself. As he crossed the courtyard, he saw Sterling standing by the statue of Whitmore's founder, her face lit by the amber glow of a street lamp. She didn't look up as he passed, and he didn't stop. But for a second, their shadows crossed, and in that quiet overlap, something like understanding passed between them, fragile, unfinished, but real. By the time Malcolm reached the maintenance wing, the janitor's cart still waited where he'd left it. He leaned the broom against the wall, sat on the edge of the sink, and finally let the exhaustion wash through him. The night was silent except for the slow dripping of a faucet. He smiled faintly. Somewhere above, in the main hall, his proof still stood untouched on the board, glowing like a promise that truth, once written, could never be erased. The morning after the final, the campus seemed quieter, though the silence felt more like awe than calm. Newspapers were already stacked at the gates, headlines shouting, "Janitor outsmarts professor in historic academic showdown." Students gathered in clusters, replaying clips on their phones, voices bubbling with disbelief and admiration. The story had gone beyond Whitmore now. National news anchors were quoting lines from the live broadcast. Analysts debating whether Sterling's challenge had crossed ethical lines. But Malcolm Reed wasn't there to hear it. He was at the hospital, sitting beside his mother's bed as sunlight filtered through the blinds, warm and forgiving. She looked smaller than usual, her frail hands folded around a rosary. "You did it," she said softly when she saw him. Her voice trembled, equal parts pride and worry. "They showed it on TV. My boy, you made them see." Malcolm smiled faintly. "I just solved a problem, Ma. That's all." "No," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "You reminded them what a man looks like when he doesn't give up." He stayed there for a while, the steady rhythm of her breathing calming him. But even in the quiet, his mind kept returning to the board, to Sterling's expression when the equations balanced perfectly. There had been something in her eyes, not hatred, not even humiliation, but a kind of recognition that unsettled him. Back on campus, the university board convened an emergency meeting. Rodriguez was there. Her tone cool and professional as she addressed the press. The committee has verified Mr. Reed's proof. It is mathematically sound and original in its approach. His work will be published under his name, as per academic integrity. Reporters fired questions like bullets. Was Sterling being investigated? Would Malcolm be reinstated as a researcher? Rodriguez handled them all with the calm of someone who had seen too many power games to be impressed. When asked about Sterling, she simply said, "Even the brightest minds must sometimes remember humility." That afternoon, Malcolm returned to Whitmore, not as a janitor, but as the man everyone now whispered about. The campus felt different, familiar, yet alien. Students nodded respectfully. Some even clapped when he passed. He wanted to disappear. But the story had made that impossible. He entered the auditorium where it had all happened. The board was still covered with his equations, preserved like an artifact. The smell of chalk lingered, mixed with the faint metallic scent of camera equipment. He stood there, tracing the lines with his eyes. Each curve and symbol carried the weight of his past, the sleepless nights, the humiliation, the endless cleaning. It wasn't just math anymore, it was memory carved in calcium dust. "I didn't erase it," a voice said behind him. Sterling stood at the doorway, dressed in plain clothes instead of her usual armor of perfection. The sharpness in her posture was gone. "I thought about it," she added, stepping closer. "But I couldn't. It's just numbers," he said, though his tone betrayed the emotion under the words. "Numbers can embarrass people too," she replied, almost smiling. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy but not hostile. Sterling looked at the board, then at him. "You should know," she began quietly. "I didn't choose that problem to humiliate you. At least, not entirely. I chose it because I was sure it couldn't be solved. I wanted to prove something about limits. I just forgot limits apply to everyone, including me." Malcolm watched her carefully. "You built a wall," he said. "And forgot walls can trap both sides." She nodded. "You're right." Her eyes softened. "I used to believe knowledge belonged to those who earned it through pedigree and papers. But you reminded me, truth doesn't care who holds the chalk." He didn't answer. He simply walked to the tray, picked up a fresh piece of chalk, and offered it to her. "Then write something true," he said. She hesitated, then took it. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote on the lower corner of the board. "The Sterling Standard is no longer the measure of genius." Below it, she signed, "Catherine Sterling, 2025. He looked at the sentence, then at her. "That's a start." She exhaled, a sound that might have been relief or surrender. "I'm recommending the board reinstate your academic status," she said. "Dr. Rodriguez has already agreed to sponsor your doctoral continuation. You deserve that chance." "And you?" he asked quietly. "What do you deserve?" She smiled faintly, almost ruefully. "A lesson I should have learned years ago." As she turned to leave, she stopped. "Mr. Reed," she said softly. "Thank you for not hating me." He wanted to say something, anything but the words stuck. Instead, he nodded. After she left, the room felt larger, emptier, as if the air itself had relaxed. He stayed there until the janitorial crew arrived for their shift. One of them, a young man named Louis, grinned. "Boss said you're a legend now. You quitting?" Malcolm shook his head. "Not yet. Somebody's gotta teach this floor how to shine." Louis laughed and moved on. Malcolm looked at his reflection in the polished surface, his own face distorted but steady. Later that week, Whitmore announced the creation of the Reed Initiative, a scholarship fund for non-traditional scholars, especially staff members who had never been given the chance to study. The press release quoted Sterling's new motto, "Genius wears many uniforms." The phrase spread across social media like wildfire. Rodriguez called him that evening. "You understand what this means?" she asked. "It means someone might finally believe cleaning floors and solving equations aren't as different as they look." "No," she said gently. "It means you gave people permission to believe again." That night, Malcolm walked across campus alone. The snow had begun to fall, soft flakes catching in the lamplight. The world was quiet, except for the sound of his footsteps crunching against the path. He reached the auditorium and looked through the glass door. The board inside was still covered in chalk. Sterling's words glowing faintly in the light. He stood there for a long moment before whispering to the empty room. Truth doesn't need a title. The wind carried his words away. Somewhere, far off, a bell rang soft, deliberate, almost like applause. He smiled, tucked his hands into his coat, and turned toward home. For once, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because he finally understood something simple and whole. That justice, when it came, didn't need fanfare. It arrived quietly, like dawn creeping through a dirty window, revealing the world as it was always meant to be seen. The spring semester at Whitmore began with sunlight filtering through the old elms, soft and golden. A light breeze carried the smell of wet stone and chalk dust from the math building, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee from the faculty lounge. The headlines had faded, the news vans were gone, but the echo of Malcolm Reed's story lingered in conversations and quiet nods from students who now swept their own desks clean before leaving a lecture. Whitmore had changed in small but visible ways. The Reed Initiative had been launched officially, and a framed photo of Malcolm still in his janitor's uniform, holding a piece of chalk hung near the admissions office with the inscription, "Truth belongs to those who seek it, not those who own it." Malcolm, however, avoided the spotlight. He spent his mornings in the lab, continuing his research under Dr. Rodriguez's guidance, and his evenings walking the quiet paths of campus. Sometimes, he still helped the custodial staff after hours, claiming it cleared his head. "Can't think straight unless the floor shines," he joked when Luis caught him polishing the hallway one night. Rodriguez had offered him an assistantship, and Sterling had kept her word, recommending his reinstatement to the doctoral program. There was no bitterness left between them, just a cautious respect, like two survivors of the same storm. She taught differently now, less like a gatekeeper, more like a guide. Some nights, when the hallways were empty, she stayed behind to work out problems alone, her hand hesitating before every answer. Once, Malcolm passed by and saw her through the glass. She didn't notice him, and he didn't interrupt. The past no longer needed to be fought, it just needed to be remembered. The world outside Whitmore had its own reactions. Editorials debated whether Malcolm's story represented the American ideal or an indictment of elitism. He ignored them all. Fame, he realized, was just another distraction, a loud voice drowning out quieter truths. What mattered now were the people who walked up to him after lectures. The night shift workers. The older students who'd given up years ago. The single mothers taking evening classes. "You made me believe it's not too late," one of them told him, eyes glistening. He smiled, unsure what to say. It wasn't heroism. It was survival, just the slow work of refusing to be erased. In early May, the university held a ceremony in the main courtyard to inaugurate the Reed Initiative. The air smelled of lilacs and cut grass. Faculty, students, and staff gathered beneath a banner that read "A New Measure of Genius." Rodriguez gave the opening remarks, her voice rich and measured. "Whitmore has long prided itself on excellence," she said. "But excellence means nothing without empathy. Today, we honor not only intellect but integrity." Then she gestured for Malcolm to step forward. He approached the podium, feeling every gaze but fearing none. "I never planned to stand here," he began. "Truth is, I never planned much of anything. I just kept showing up one shift, one floor, one board at a time. People think what happened in that auditorium was about proving someone wrong. But it wasn't. It was about remembering that genius doesn't come with a title, and dignity doesn't need permission." The audience was silent, the kind of silence that meant listening, not judgment. He continued, voice steady. "If there's one thing I learned cleaning those halls, it's that dirt always finds its way back. So does truth. You can polish the floor, or you can cover it up, but sooner or later, the light shows what's real." He stepped back from the microphone. The applause that followed wasn't wild or loud. It was deep, sustained, honest. Sterling was among the first to stand. Later, when most people had dispersed, she approached him quietly. "You were right," she said. "About walls." He smiled. "You were right too," he answered. "About limits. They only matter if we stop reaching." She looked up at the banner fluttering above them, the word genius swaying against the blue sky. "You've changed this place," she said softly. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe it was ready to change and just needed someone to start sweeping." That evening, Malcolm returned to his small apartment in Roxbury. His mother was sitting by the window, knitting something soft and gray. The oxygen machine was gone now. Her health had improved with the warmer weather. She looked up when he entered. "You missed your ceremony," she said. "I was there," he smiled. "Just in the back. Watching. Always watching," she teased. "You should stand where people can see you. Maybe next time." He handed her a small box. Inside was a silver brooch shaped like a spiral, engraved with the symbols from his proof. "For you," he said. "You earned it more than I did." She touched it gently, eyes shining. "You found your way back, didn't you?" "Maybe I never left," he said. The next morning, he arrived early at the university. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the campus was quiet except for the hum of streetlights. He entered the auditorium and turned on the stage lights. The chalkboard still bore faint traces of the proof, ghostly white lines refusing to fade completely. He took the eraser and wiped the board clean, slow and deliberate. The dust hung in the air like morning fog. Then he picked up a piece of chalk and wrote, in neat letters, "Intelligence doesn't wear a uniform. Truth doesn't need a title." He looked at the words for a long time, then set the chalk down. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the windows, and the hall filled with a soft gold glow. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, coffee in hand. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Just finishing up," he replied. "Old habits." She smiled. "There's a class here at 8. You're welcome to stay. They're studying variational methods." "That sounds familiar," he said with a grin. "It should. You wrote half the syllabus." He laughed quietly, surprised. "You're serious?" "Completely," she said. "If you're ready, I think it's time they heard it from you." He hesitated, looking around the empty hall. "Me? Teach?" "You already did," she said. "They just didn't know they were learning." He stood there for a moment, the weight of years settling into something light. "All right," he said finally. "Let's see if the floors remember." As the sun climbed higher, the first students arrived, their chatter filling the hall. Malcolm stayed near the board, watching them take their seats. When the room quieted, he turned and began to speak not as a janitor, not as a prodigy, but as a man who had learned that the pursuit of truth was the purest kind of work. His voice was calm, sure, threaded with humor and warmth. The students listened, rapt, their pencils scratching furiously. Outside, the world moved on as it always did, buses rumbling down Massachusetts Avenue, pigeons cooing on ledges, but inside that hall, something felt still, sacred. By the time he finished, the board was full again, lines of chalk gleaming under the lights. He stepped back, smiling faintly, and brushed his hands together. Dust rose and caught the sunlight, scattering into tiny, glittering specks. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the simple peace of knowing he was exactly where he belonged. And as the final bell rang, echoing through the corridors, Malcolm Reed walked out into the brightness of a new day, the sound of chalk still whispering behind him like a quiet applause that never ended.